I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
It's good to see you. And producer Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Welcome, everybody. It's about Donald J. Trump. Surprise, surprise.
Hey, that's right, Ralph. First up, we welcome back our resident constitutional scholar and most frequent guest, Bruce Fein, who's going to break down President Donald Trump's second inaugural address, which Bruce says was, quote, earmarked by narcissism, bigotry, belligerency, mendacity, stupendous lies that would have even embarrassed Pinocchio, end quote. But the difference between Trump and Pinocchio is that the fictional puppet was capable of feeling shame, and eventually he became a real boy. Next up, we welcome back the co-president of Public Citizen, Robert Weissman. Within minutes of Trump taking the oath, Public Citizen, along with the State Democracy Defenders Fund and the American Federation of Government Employees, sued President Trump and the Office of Management and Budget over the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. The lawsuit charges that DOGE violates the Federal Advisory Committee Act because DOGE's members do not have a fair balance of viewpoints. Meetings are held in secret and without public notice, and records and work product are not available to the public. Each of the three organizations previously asked to join the advisory committee and, surprise, surprise, were turned down. We'll delve into all of that with Rob. Finally, it was impossible not to notice the tech titan sitting behind self-proclaimed man of the people Donald Trump at his inauguration. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Elon Musk, and the guy from Google. So we're bringing on Public Citizens Government Affairs lobbyist Craig Holman to talk about the flood of donations from corporations and billionaires to Trump's inaugural fund, and how the presidential inauguration has gone from a small ceremony marking the peaceful transition of power to a bacchanal of bribery. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, what is Donald Trump going to try to get away with in his second term? David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and an expert on international law. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, and he is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, as well as American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Bruce. Listeners, be patient here. We have a very serious problem from the Trump regime, which we'll go through with some systematic sequence. He did not hide what he's going to do. So let's get started, Bruce. Lay out what you interpreted his inaugural performance to be.
Well, first, let me paint by broad strokes, and then we can get more detail. But the gist of his inaugural statement was that he would go invade any country that he decided was contrary to U.S. interests, including specifically, he's mentioned Panama. He told lies about China allegedly operating the canal, which is not true. He suggested that because we built the canal after we stole Panama in 1903 by military intervention, we should be able to steal it again since we spent a lot of money on it. And he made it clear that, well, he proclaimed his adherence to peace. He wanted to be the peace president. He was willing to go anywhere, anytime, any place to just make sure that American swagger was respected. He had all of the vocabulary of a bully. And the second thing that he suggested that in his speech is that, well, he says, again, euphemistically, he's going to rebalance the scales of justice. He has his own enemies list that he's already established a special group. Unfortunately, there's precedent. There was Jimmy Hoffa's squad under Bobby Kennedy, which was a clear abuse of process where the Justice Department was used as a vendetta against a person who Bobby Kennedy hated. But now he's expanded that Jimmy Hoffa squad to get anyone, who would be a critic of Donald Trump. And he can, with all the powers of the Justice Department, even if you're not guilty, they can turn your life upside down, issuing subpoenas, having the FBI talk to all of your friends and neighbors, stigmatizing your name without an actual trial or things of that sort. So there are no guardrails anymore in Mr. Trump's world. In some sense, he was kind of contradicting himself by, on the one hand, believing that he's supposed to deregulate the economy, he wants to create jobs, and on the other hand, he says that he's going to have he's issued an executive order that all of his cabinet members must use the plenary authority in order to lower costs, lower prices and jump productivity. Like, what are you going to do? Use the Army out there, the Navy, the Air Force? It shows again that he really doesn't have any concern for institutions or checks and balances. He believes he's got limitless power to do anything that he wants. Then the last thing I'll focus on, because it's pretty nerve-wracking, is he basically said that illegal immigration across the southern border is a war and it's an invasion. And he's going to, notwithstanding the Posse Comitatus Act, which says you can't use the military for law enforcement, he's dispatching the military to the southern border. Who knows what they may use? Weapons to kill defenseless women and children fleeing oppression from their home countries. He also said that he's identifying the drug cartels in Mexico who exist because of our own insatiable demand for fentanyl and cocaine or whatever as foreign terrorist organizations. So that probably presages he's going to fire drones into Mexico. Anyway, it's clearly a man without any limits whatsoever. What was striking, in fact, was nowhere in the entire 30 or 29 minutes does he suggest Congress even exists. He just whited out any other institutions as having any further vitality in our constitutional domain. So that's something very, very troublesome. And I think we can expect more of the same as the days unfold.
Well, the other presents at the inaugural events were the billionaires. Elon Musk, Tim Cook of Apple, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, renamed Meta, the head of Google. We saw them all over, genuflecting, being very visible in their support of Der Fuhrer. And this reminds one of the early years of Hitler's Germany, where I.G. Farben and the Krupp Works decided that they were going to bond with him. He was going to rebuild the military. He was going to give them a lot of profits, and they were going to support him all the way, which became the definition of the corporate state. So what millions of Americans saw on January 20 was a further deepening in the takeover by these billionaires who want three things from government. They want lower or no taxes. They want throwing off regulatory standards, health, safety, economic protection of consumers, and they want the honeypot, the huge procurement contracts that Elon Musk has with Starlink and SpaceX and all that. And of course, the other Silicon Valley companies are not only getting contracts, but they're getting corporate welfare, billions of dollars, begging them to build plants here and move from China, for example. Intel is getting a big one. Even some foreign companies like Taiwan Semiconductor to build plants in the U.S. with huge taxpayer subsidies. And basically, Trump is a partner. Do you agree that about the only thing that can bring these people down is egregious corruption and violation of criminal laws that are perceived by everybody in the country to be a cause for prosecution of these crooks? Do you see any possibility of that?
The difficulty we have on that is Trump would likely pardon them all, just like, unfortunately, Joe Biden pardoned all his families and others, prior to leaving office, another gross abuse of power. And I think what you've described, Ralph, accurately is we now basically have a plutocracy. One of the people that you omitted was the head of TikTok. Now, why is TikTok there? They know with their money and access to the president, and that's why the president said, well, you got 75 additional days to try to find a buyer, even though the statute gave 270 days and he's not gone back. So it's, again, just to buy government power for an economic business purpose. And I see that this is basically the culmination of Citizens United basically saying you can spend limitless amounts of money in politics. There can be no First Amendment regulation of the amount of spending, and therefore everybody's on the payroll of some sort or another. But you're absolutely right. You can, I think sitting on that platform at the inauguration was probably trillions of dollars held by individuals, not by companies, just individuals. Fabulous wealth. And you have to ask, if these are business people, why are you at the political event? Why aren't you building a better mousetrap? Why aren't you like Thomas Edison, looking to find new ways of doing business? It's because all of their profits come on manipulating government in their favor. It's the opposite of so-called capitalism.
I want you to talk about the executive orders. You have been very critical of executive orders of past presidents. What are they exactly? When are they legal? When are they illegal? And are really enforceable or just sort of recommendations to departments in the government?
Well, first of all, executive orders are what the lawyers call atextual, in the sense that there's not a single syllable in the United States Constitution that suggests that the president enjoys power to issue executive orders which purport to have the same legal dignity as legislation passed by Congress. They're nothing. So they really didn't even appear on the constitutional scene until Franklin Roosevelt, going off the gold standard. Dubious, and Roosevelt had many, many evasions of the law, but now we have executive orders issued regularly. And it's part, I think, Ralph, of the super, imperial presidency where Congress doesn't care. They can't get together on legislation. The president says, well, I'll issue an executive order. He can always get at least half of Congress to be in his favor. And it's very, very difficult to have standing to challenge executive orders. Sometimes you can, but they purport to be just a piece of legislation that the president issues and says, well, I'm making the country safe or better, but there's nothing in Article 2 that says that's the role of the president. That's the role of Congress. But Congress, unfortunately, surrenders that power.
Let's take two of them that are truly devastating. He issued an executive order withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords. And he also issued an executive order withdrawing from the World Health Organization. So here he's withdrawing the United States from the two omnicides. One is mass pandemics that require the cooperation of nations under the World Health Organization, an arm of the United Nations, because pandemics don't recognize national borders, do they? And the second, he's withdrawing from doing anything other than drill oil, gas, coal. He's withdrawing from the Paris Accords, which provide for commitments and cooperation between nations to fight the ongoing climate disruptions, climate violence that we see everywhere in the United States and around the world. So how does the public, how does the Congress, how does this country respond to those two executive orders? And you think they're illegal?
Well, I would differentiate. The problem of some of these, Ralph, is that the agreements were entered into rather than by treaty, which is what's supposed to happen when you have an agreement with a foreign nation, by an executive order entering. And then if you enter by executive order, you can exit by the executive order. We saw that in part when Obama had the executive order creating this joint comprehensive plan of action on containing Iran's nuclear ambitions. Okay, you issue it, and then Trump comes in and he repeals it. A treaty, by definition, is an agreement between sovereign states, right? Not individual. And so when you make an agreement like Paris Agreement was between sovereign states, so was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, you're supposed to submit it to a treaty, and you need 2/3 votes in the treaty. So the problem that we have here is when Congress no longer defends its treaty power.
What you're basically saying is our legislature now is Trump in the White House. He's legislating through these executive orders. I guess there are going to be dozens of them, aren't there?
Oh, yeah, they're already done. Some of them are more important than others, like changing the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. I've suggested, pretty soon we'll wake up and say, oh, the South China Sea is now the Great American Sea. And what does China have anything to do with the South China Sea off of its mainland? Others are more important, I believe, in terms of their immediate impact or currently what you can foresee, namely the so-called decree overriding Section 1 of the 14th Amendment saying there's no longer birthright citizenship, although that's been accorded for 150 years. And it's been really upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case in 1898. And I believe he's done this just so he can blame the courts for striking it down. He probably knows he's going to lose. It's using the law as a political football, which really takes away from the dignity of law anymore. It then becomes a jumble of political calculations with ulterior motives. We don't have a rule of law anymore. And people ought to be very worried about that.
Well, they ought to be very worried about a new ominous position now by Trump that he didn't evince in his first term. And this one even startled me. I wondered why he kept praising President McKinley. He wanted to rename the peak in Alaska from Denali back to Mount McKinley. And listeners, this is something which is really very ominous. By his talk about getting back the Panama Canal, getting Greenland, and other imperial acquisitions, he's basically modeling himself after McKinley. We're talking here about 19th century, early 20th century imperialism that we all thought was a thing of the past. Explain why he likes McKinley in the context of the Panama Canal, Greenland, and Canada.
It goes back even further than that. He also said, Ralph, even prior to McKinley, he used the word manifest destiny. That was the battle cry for invading Mexico illegally in 1846, based upon a lie that the Mexican soldiers had killed an American soldier on American soil. So manifest destiny is a bugle to just go attack any country you want based upon lies. But then the McKinley analogy, I say, takes it to a new level. McKinley was notorious for, one, illegally annexed Hawaii after our Marines overthrew the regime of Queen Uliukulani. He didn't have a treaty to annex it. It was a legislation. Then he exploited the falsity of the Spanish alleged complicity in blowing up the USS Maine in Havana Harbor to provoke the Spanish-American War. Then after he defeats the Spanish and Cuba is independent, then he continues the war in the Philippines, denies them self-determination, which is the whole purpose of the war, and has a war of annihilation against Filipinos, including waterboarding, slaughtering anybody over 10 years old. Then he acquires Puerto Rico. All of these things under the claim that, well, we're just carrying liberation and our sacred chosen people to all other places of the world under our angelic ideas.
This is a remarkable extension of empire. Listeners, you have to realize this man is unstable. He's a megalomaniac. He believes God spared him in Butler, Pennsylvania, for the missions that he's declared on January 20th. He believes that the Supreme Court and the Congress will let him do whatever he wants. And he's got the MAGA, very fervent followers around the country ready to hit the streets in no uncertain terms. And his polls are holding up. Now, Bruce, listen to this. He can literally take Greenland. There are only 58,000 people in Greenland. It's an autonomous part of Denmark, but is seeking independence, which in fact will leave it completely defenseless, because at least when it's part of Denmark, Denmark is part of NATO, and Trump's have a hard time attacking a member of NATO, which the U.S. is the big booster and sponsor from the beginning. But we have a major Air Force base there. All he has to do is basically bring in a few brigades in the Air Force base, and he can conquer Greenland. And he's already said nothing can stop us in his speeches. Manifest destiny, nothing can stop us. Now, listeners, Greenland is a quarter the size of the United States. It's the largest island in the world. It's loaded with key minerals to be exploited, and it's also loaded with melting ice. And if the Greenland ice cap melts, we're really in trouble around the world in terms of sea level. That's how thick and deep and extensive the Greenland ice cap is. And it's already melting. But if it melts big time, we're in trouble in Miami, in New York, Los Angeles, any cities that are on the ocean around the world. So there's nothing that can stop them from doing this. The same with Panama. The U.S. Navy could take Panama in a few days under orders from Trump. So what if he does these two things? And he's known for doing what he says he wants to do. He's not like Democrats, make promises and then forget them right after the election. I mean, this guy is a true believer in himself and his destiny, and he wants to be the greatest president in the United States, and he sees this by growing America. In other words, vastly increasing the acreage under the Stars and Stripes, namely Greenland. He even has a design on Canada. He knows he can't get away with that at all. He said Canada should be our 51st state, and he referred to Prime Minister Trudeau pejoratively as Governor Trudeau. So let's say he does this in Greenland and the Panama Canal. Is he going to get away with it?
I think in the short term, maybe. But I go back to Adolf Hitler. Yeah, he got away with Anschluss and the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. Poland for a while, Netherlands and Belgium and Denmark and Norway for a while. But it'll so antagonize the entire world that we will confront China allied with Russia, allied with virtually everybody except Israel, maybe. And I don't think Israel will care about us. They're their own chosen people, and everything that they do is based upon their belief that, God has given them the promised land. They'll stay there. So I doubt they'll come to much of our aid, and we will be destroyed like Adolf Hitler. You remember that this lust for power transcends all reason. We're endowed with that lust.
We've been talking with Bruce Fine, a frequent guest on our program. And for those of you who are interested in his views on constitutional government or empire, he's written 2 books on the subject. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you for inviting me, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Bruce Fine. We will link to his memo at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we've got a double shot of Public Citizen featuring co-president Rob Weissman and government affairs lobbyist Craig Holman to talk about the resistance that organization is mounting against an administration that is dead set on being corrupt and lawless. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 24, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Senator Shelley Moore Capito just bought some GE Aerospace stock. Senator Capito sits on the Defense Subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee, where she votes on various defense spending bills. The reason we know Senator Capito bought the stock is because of a law passed in 2012, which requires disclosure of stock trades and prohibits insider trading on non-public information. The law is weak, and its insider trading ban has never been enforced, as far as we know. There have been bipartisan calls in Congress that would prohibit members of Congress from owning and trading stocks, but those efforts have gone nowhere. Why? Because members of Congress love making money by trading stocks. A September 2022 New York Times analysis found that 13 members of Congress reported that they or their immediate family members had bought or sold shares of companies that were under investigation by their committees. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest hasn't wasted any time challenging the new Trump administration in court. David?
Robert Weissman is a staunch public interest advocate and activist, as well as an expert on a wide variety of issues ranging from corporate accountability and government transparency to trade and globalization to economic and regulatory policy. As the president of Public Citizen, he has spearheaded the effort to loosen the chokehold corporations and the wealthy have over our democracy. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Rob Weissman.
Great to be with you.
Rob, let's get right to the lawsuit that you, Public Citizen, and a couple other plaintiffs, the State Democracy Defenders Fund, and the American Federation of Government Employees, filed to challenge the illegality of the so-called government department efficiency run by Elon Musk, which is not a government department. It is an advisory committee that has to obey the rules of the federal advisory law. Can you describe the thrust of the litigation before we get into your definition of government efficiency, which is being ignored by Elon Musk and Donald Trump?
So Trump conspired with Elon Musk to create what they're calling the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which, as you mentioned, is not actually a government department. It's really an advisory committee. The alleged purpose is to advance efficiency of the government. But what it's really about is rolling back regulations, the things that give us clean air, clean water, safe food, fair workplace, economic justice, protections against discrimination, and more, to benefit corporate bottom lines on the one hand, and on the other, to pursue a right-wing libertarian extremist agenda of slashing government spending, especially to protect the most poor and vulnerable. They're using
including Medicaid.
Absolutely, including Medicaid and supplemental nutrition assistance. And they're using efficiency as a cover for that. Our lawsuit looks at the structure of this new entity, which we believe is an advisory committee. And as you mentioned, if it's an advisory committee, it has to follow the laws governing advisory committees, which require that the membership of the committee be fair and balanced, that the committee operate according to an established charter, that it publish in advance its meeting agendas, the meetings be open, and that it follow open records laws. This Doge enterprise is doing none of those things. We need that kind of openness and balance and transparency to offset the ideological and corporate agenda that Musk is pursuing, and also even to figure out exactly what it is he's doing. So we filed the case with the two partners you mentioned 2 minutes after Trump was inaugurated, and we're going to see where it goes.
And then to describe the conflict of interest rules and disclosure of Musk's economic interests as invalidating his participation.
Right. So if it's an advisory committee and is recognized as such, you can have a conflict and participate on the advisory committee, but that's supposed to be offset by other people who have differing interests. Be that as it may, Musk has conflicts before the government that almost for sure have no parallel in all of American history, given the breadth of his business interests. For example, he wants Twitter, now called X, to be a money transmitter like Apple Pay. If that's the case, it would be regulated by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Musk has tweeted that he wants to have the CFPB deleted. He is the subject of enforcement actions in probably 9 separate cases, him and his companies, from multiple agencies, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, which says he's deceived investors around Twitter. Many analysts think that's an open and shut case, but he's saying it's weaponization of government. He has gigantic interests at the Pentagon, NASA, and the Federal Communications Commission related to his rocket company and Starlink, his satellite telecommunications company, involving both government contracts and regulatory issues, and whether competitors are going to be able to mount a challenge to him. For example, NASA may employ one company or might employ 2 companies to build rockets for it. He might prefer just one. Tesla has interests at the Department of Transportation regarding the safety of its self-driving cars, and on and on and on. And Musk is in position through this Doge enterprise to influence decisions at all of those agencies in ways that will benefit him. The market certainly thinks he's going to benefit because his personal wealth has gone up about $150 billion since Trump was elected, as the stock of his companies has risen, presumably because investors believe, in fact, that government decisions are going to favor his companies going forward.
Well, as you mentioned, Musk provided a preliminary list of the areas that he wants cut in terms of government spending, and they're all people protection areas. He left out all the corporate ravages and predatory activities on the federal government that are far greater in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars. Can you explain them, the 3 categories that you have spoken about: the military budget, the corporate welfare, and the corporate crime on government tax revenues, like Medicare?
Yeah, well, when it comes to just saving money, which is not really what efficiency means, but it's one part of efficiency. You do what you're doing in the most efficient way possible for get the most bang for the government buck and deliver the most for taxpayers and consumers. Musk said at first he wanted to try to cut $2 trillion from the budget every year. That's an impossibility since the entire budget of discretionary spending is less than $2 trillion. Apparently, if you're the richest person in the history of the world, you don't actually have to know anything that you're talking about to be taken seriously. In any case, what he's really focused on, as you say, is cutting programs to benefit poor people. The big items that you could cut if you were vicious and didn't care about the consequences for human beings, and you did want to protect corporations, is Medicaid spending and spending on food nutrition, known as colloquially as food stamps. So that's where he's going. We said, all right, that's not efficient. If you actually care about efficiency, what could you do? Well, you could save about $100 billion a year by eliminating Medicare Advantage, the privatized Medicare system that's ripping off Medicare in a systemic and fast-growing way. You could save consumers and taxpayers easily $200 billion a year by doing a variety of relatively modest things to deal with excessive drug prices. If you brought U.S. drug prices down to the levels in other rich countries, it would be more than $200 billion a year in savings. The Pentagon is basically a program. Half of the Pentagon spending is on outside contractors and is a source of deep and profound corporate waste and welfare. You could easily cut $200 billion every year from the Pentagon budget. Now we're up to $500 billion a year in savings, and it's not trivial money. You could cut $20 billion a year in subsidies for the oil and gas industry, and on and on and on. And by the way, if you're going to be efficient, you should not just be looking at cuts, you should be looking at raising money efficiently too. And modestly, we could raise an additional $500 billion in tax revenue every single year with reasonable, actually not very aggressive increases on taxes on the rich and large corporations.
Let's go back to the lawsuit. What would you like the court to do? And if they do what your complaint asks them to do, how enforceable do you think it is under a Trump can do anything he wants attitude?
Well, what we're entitled to under the law regarding advisory committees is an order to stop the advisory committee from continuing its business and functioning until it complies with the law, which would mean expanding the membership so that the committee membership was fair and balanced, and that it took the steps that I mentioned to operate openly and transparently, having a clear mission, charter, publishing the agenda of its meetings, having open meetings, and preserving and maintaining open records. And we're hopeful that the courts will move expeditiously to require exactly that. Now, there is a question, that should be a ridiculous question, but it's not anymore, which is what if the Trump administration just refuses to follow orders from court? I think so far, even taking into account the utter lawlessness of the last Trump term, slowly perhaps, they do tend to do what the courts order them to do, or at least stop doing things the courts say they can't do. And all we can do is push forward and assume some adherence to the rule of law, that we're not in a complete Wild West. Otherwise, we're sacrificing tools that are otherwise available to us. And we certainly can't concede to a regime of lawlessness.
The problem, of course, as you know so well, Robert Weissman, is if you win at the trial level, the Trump Justice Department can appeal and appeal and appeal, and the months turn into years. In the meantime, they're doing exactly what you're filing a lawsuit to prohibit them from doing. And by the way, listeners, this is no modest technical lawsuit. The president of the American Federation of Government Employees, one of the co-plaintiffs in this lawsuit we're talking about, has said, quote, AFGE will not stand idly by as a secretive group of ultra-wealthy individuals with major conflicts of interest attempt to deregulate themselves and give their own companies sweetheart government contracts while firing civil servants and dismantling the institutions designed to serve the American people, end quote. So what you're trying to straighten out and make accountable is sort of a government within the government led by Elon Musk.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, just to go back to the first part, it is true that litigation often drags out, and we can't force the speed with which the court will consider our case. If we win at the first order, though, I do think we'll have an injunction. So I think dragging it out is not going to be a useful strategy if we're able to prevail in the first instance. They're going to need to win or to comply with the order. But to the bigger point you're making, I think that's exactly right. There's both the specifics of this, which is Musk is taking control of policymaking in this administration. Maybe immigration is being handled by Stephen Miller, maybe Greenland is being handled by Donald Trump, but the core policymaking agenda, Musk has grabbed control. So it couldn't be more important. And there's, I think, an even deeper aspect to this, which is Musk isn't just anybody. He is the richest person in the history of the world. And he's getting an office inside the White House. He's getting a government email address. He's functioning to direct government policy, incidentally raised his wealth by $150 billion. But this tight convergence of corporate and state sectors, I don't think has any precedent in American history. And as you've taught me, Ralph, many times and for many years, it was Mussolini who said that the convergence of corporate and state power is one of the indicators of fascism. I don't necessarily know that this means we're in a fascist society, but it is an indicator, and it is deeply, deeply troubling.
How do you appeal to the people around the country, as Public Citizen has done, to develop a fundamental base of support for what you're trying to do? Because you have other strategies that you have written about in Public Citizen's newspaper. People can go to citizen.org in order to get a reading of that. You're going to be filing a lot of actions, and I hope you'll try to get Congress to hold some hearings, unofficial hearings by the Democratic Party that's in the minority now. Let's face it, Trump's main power is his fanatical support of the MAGA people around the country. They have huge energy and huge determination. They're messianic. How are you going to go out to the people? And who are going to be your allies? Unions? Who else?
That's right. And I think one thing we have to be careful about is people feel defeated right now. And this was a horrible election result, but it is not the case that Trump had some overwhelming majority put him into office. And it's not the case that the Republicans have gained a vice grip on the Congress. So we're in for some really rough times, and there's no point of lying about that. It's unbelievably dangerous. But it's not as if there's an overwhelming majority that's behind this kind of agenda. In fact, even Trump supporters, by and large, aren't behind the kind of agenda that Musk is now driving forward that really wasn't part of Trump's campaigning at all. So I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of strategies to pursue, but the most important thing, as you're suggesting, is to mobilize the public. And I think there's two parts to that, but it does depend on really reminding people that engagement matters and that we can collectively make a difference. One part is to energize and mobilize people who do and have opposed Trump to make sure they don't give up, don't despair, don't retreat. We've got time for that. The Women's March played a singular role in the first Trump administration in mobilizing what became to colloquially be called the resistance. The Women's March is a once-in-a-lifetime event. We're not going to repeat that, and we didn't, but we're going to find new ways to call together and mobilize people on the streets to oppose Trump. And the other part of the equation, I think, is appealing to people who have supported Trump but aren't part of the Messianic movement. And that's tricky because the information systems are so segmented now. But I think the core message deals with the things that we're talking about. People didn't really vote for Trump because of his specific policy agenda, at least in this space. And it's hard to even know what his specific policy agenda is. But they did have some sense of grievance, and they especially had a sense of economic dislocation. That's real lived experience. And for whatever reason, they came to believe that he was the pathway forward to dealing with that, primarily because of attitude and maybe some recognition that he offered them more than anything else. And I think we have to just keep pushing ourselves to break through these information bubbles, but be really clear about what's happening. The Musk agenda, which is the Trump agenda, is designed to benefit rich corporations, to steal money from everybody else and transfer it to the wealthy. It's really as simple as that, with some add-ons of gratuitous harm to poor and vulnerable people, many of whom actually voted for Trump. So it's not so easy to explain those things clearly against the backdrop of Trump chaos, but I think that's our mission and challenge, and it's certainly what Public Citizen is going to try to do. And we're working with everybody we possibly can. You know, everybody from the labor movement to other consumer organizations to big mobilizing organizations to the civil rights community. We're going to try to do everything possible to work with and stand in solidarity with immigrant rights organizations and all that they're going to face right now. And we're going to need as big a coalition as possible to take on this most dangerous period, this most dangerous president.
The most ominous aspects of his speech at his inauguration was Panama Canal, Greenland, indicating that he's going to take these areas by force, which, of course, is one reason why he praised President McKinley, who took over Puerto Rico and in the Philippines, seized Hawaii, etc., Cuba. But the most ominous thing domestically, which will affect Trump voters as well as non-Trump voters, is that he's pulling out of the World Health Organization and he's pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, which in effect renders our country defenseless against doing anything about tornadoes and hurricanes and wildfires and droughts and sea level rising, all the other aspects of climate violence, and of doing anything to foresee and forestall coming pandemics by breaking any kind of relationships with the WHO group of nations cooperating on the matter of dealing with pandemics. So this opens an opportunity for the Democratic Party in Congress to keep raising these issues and drawing lines with the Republicans, starting with raising the minimum wage, which the Republicans will always be against, and raising the climate issues, raising the pandemic issues, and raising many of the New Deal, update, economic agenda issues, strengthening labor unions, and the like. So Public Citizen's got a role in its Congress Watch arm in order to activate the Democrats. They can go to the floor of the Congress. They can make their positions known at congressional hearings, however dominated they are by Republican chairs, and they can conduct unofficial hearings on Capitol Hill, the way John Conyers and others have done in the past when they were in the minority. What's your view of the congressional presence of public citizen?
Yeah, well, let me first comment on the Paris Agreement and the WHO. It's so important that you're highlighting that. I think those things are reported as sort of foreign policy issues in the sense of, oh, Trump doesn't really want to get along with other countries and maybe he doesn't really believe in international institutions without regard to the substance of what those agreements and institutions are about. He has an agenda of racing us toward climate apocalypse. It's sort of a embrace of collective self-suicide. So we're going to have to work very, very hard on that. Really just to mitigate, well, best we're going to be able to do is mitigate the harm that he does on climate. We at Public Citizen are working very hard on that, as are many others. On WHO, the World Health Organization, exactly as you say, it's not as if we could really imagine there might be a worldwide pandemic that kills lots of people where we need lots of cooperation. But maybe just against the possibility that could happen, we should stay part of an international institution. That actually is international agreement. It's not so easy to just withdraw. So we're looking at the possibilities to see if we might be able to prevent that from happening. On the big congressional questions you're asking, it relates to the prior thing we were talking about. I can promise you that Public Citizen is going to do everything we can to push the Democrats in the way you said. And I think, there's going to be an initial period of just trying to deal with the torrent of things that come from Trump. But after a period passes, measured in months, not beyond that, I think there's going to be an opportunity and a necessity to really clarify a bold agenda in an umbrella way and also in specific issue areas, and then really start pushing the Democrats to be ready with an aggressive agenda. We did that in 2017 around democracy issues, and we came up with the most far-reaching transformative democracy legislation since the civil rights era. And we came, just a vote or two short in the Senate of passing that into law. So, it's our duty and our obligation and our opportunity to do that again going forward, not just in that space, but across the board. But I think the way it connects to what we were talking about is the degree to which the Democrats are strong or weak. I'd like to think depends a little bit on what Public Citizen does, and we're going to do everything we can. But it ultimately depends on whether they feel pressure and support from the public, from their constituents, to be strong. One thing the Women's March did in 2017 was suddenly create a backbone in a party that had really been looking for opportunities to cooperate with Trump right after the 2016 election. And we're going to have to bring that same kind of pressure again to make the weak Democrats stronger and to make the strong Democrats be bolder than they otherwise would be.
Well, the Democratic Party has a great opportunity if it can rise to the occasion, because Trump's policies are going to severely damage Trump voters and Trump supporters around the country, just as they damage everyone else. When you have anti-worker policies, when you freeze the minimum wage, when you cut back on Medicaid, when you cut back on pollution controls, etc., everybody suffers, regardless of whether they're Trumpsters or anti-Trumpsters. And when that message gets driven home, then more and more of these Trump voters who will start evaluating Trump on how he's impacting where they live, work, and raise their families, not some abstract ideologies or slogans, will turn against him, because they will see quite correctly that he is a government of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations, and he's betraying them. So that's the opportunity the Democratic Party has. Tell people how they get the Doji report, which didn't get enough media coverage.
As you referenced, Ralph, we published a report called Doge Delusions that offered what an evidence-based, non-ideological, non-corporate friendly approach would be to government efficiency. And folks can check out the details of that report on our website at citizen.org.
Okay, our time is up. We've been talking with Robert Weissman, President of Public Citizen. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you.
And we've been speaking with Rob Weissman. We will link to Public Citizen at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
How much did it cost to swear in Donald Trump? Where did that money go? And where did it come from? David?
Craig Holman serves as Public Citizen's Capitol Hill lobbyist on ethics, lobbying, and campaign finance rules. He is also working with European non-governmental organizations and members of the European Commission and Parliament in developing a lobbyist registration system for the European Union. Previously, he was senior policy analyst at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, and he has assisted in drafting campaign finance reform legislation including pay-to-play legislation, and has conducted numerous research projects on the initiative process and the impact of money in politics. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Craig Holman.
Glad to be here, David and Ralph. Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome, Craig. You've studied more than most people the bacchanalia of money swarming over inaugurations. Most prominently, of course, the Trump one on January 20th, but in prior inaugurations for prior presidents, the money is unregulated. It is swarming over the candidates and the parties and the balls in order to get privileges and contracts and deregulation. So it's a real political quid pro quo event. So you think it should be reformed. And we're going to talk about those reforms after we hear from you describing what enormous expansion of corporate money being poured into these inauguration events every 4 years. And for our framework listeners, I want to mention that Thomas Jefferson avoided all the inaugural pomp and circumstance in 1801 and simply walked from his rented room to the U.S. Capitol in casual clothing for his swearing in. That was Thomas Jefferson. We've come a long way since that display of humility and frugality. Take it from there, Craig.
Sure, the dramatic change in the financing of the inaugural conventions really began with Ronald Reagan in 1985. Prior to that, the inaugural events were generally low-key affairs. You know, Thomas Jefferson obviously is the lowest key, ever. He just got sworn in and then walked back home. But, even after that, FDR during World War II thought it would be vulgar to have too much of a celebration. And so he scaled it back as well. And, each presidential inaugural committee spent relatively little on the inaugural events until 1985. I mean, Richard Nixon in 1973 spent less than $4 million on his inaugural event. Jimmy Carter spent even less than that, slightly over $3 million. And by the way, Jimmy Carter is another president who walked to the swearing-in ceremony and then walked back again. It was Ronald Reagan that suddenly started breaking all records. In 1985, he's raised and spent $20 million. So we went from less than $4 million to suddenly up to $20 million. And generally, that's sort of been the ballpark for most inaugural events since then. I mean, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, the second Bush, all really around the range of 20 to 30 million. Barack Obama boosted it up a bit when he got up to about 53 million on his inauguration. But that was that was a high peak. Then suddenly Donald Trump stepped into office in 2017, and he doubled that amount. 107 million was raised and spent from private sources on his inauguration. And this inauguration that we just witnessed, the most historic, obscene victory celebration that we've ever seen, Donald Trump appears to have raised about $250 million to pay for this event. There are so many troubling things about this. First of all, to spend that much on a party, I find outrageous in its own right. But secondly, where does this money come from? And it comes from increasingly large sources. I mean, the cryptocurrency industry had a field day in this inauguration. You had Ripple, Coinbase, Robinhood, MoonPay, Kraken, all throwing in more than $1 million. Ripple threw in $5 million to finance this inaugural activity. And they've got, front row seats at the various dinners and receptions. Even the fact that the cold weather shut down much of the celebration here, it really just shut it down for the average citizens. They're the ones who really ended up not being able to celebrate that much. They got sent over to the Capital One Arena, and about, I think, 30,000 people could fit in there for the celebration. But all the $1 million balls and dinners and receptions and meetings with the cabinet officials, that all happened. And so this was just a field day. for billionaires and millionaires. Not only cryptocurrency, by the way, but big tech and Wall Street were the other two big industries financing this whole inauguration. And I want to emphasize, I mean, a lot of these companies have given to prior inaugurations, but they typically have given in amounts of maybe $50,000 or $100,000. All the people that I just cited, all those companies that I just cited, each gave $1 million or more. Now, Ralph, you were asking about the rules. You know, the rules for the financing of inaugurations are very lax because the inaugurations were never really intended to be these big influence peddling soirees. So there are only two rules in effect. One is foreign nationals cannot donate. Anyone else can, any corporation, any wealthy special interest, any wealthy individual, billionaires, they can all contribute, no limits on how much they can give. And the second rule is that 90 days after the inauguration, we're talking 3 months, so sometime in spring, the inaugural committee has to release to the public records of donors of $200 or more. They do not disclose how the money was spent, so we don't end up knowing that. And there are no rules regulating how the surplus funds are dealt with afterwards, not even disclosure. So whatever Trump is going to do with those surplus funds, and you can bet there's going to be a lot because this inaugural event was largely frozen out for the public anyway. So there's going to be a huge surplus, no rules on how the Donald Trump Inaugural Committee deals with it. And Donald Trump doesn't even have to tell us what he's done with the surplus funds.
Can it go to him?
It can go to him through his business enterprises. The inaugural committee is a nonprofit, so it has to abide by the Internal Revenue Code. So it can't just take money and put it directly in Trump's pocket. But what it can do is buy products and services from the Trump industries, go to super PACs that are designed to facilitate what Trump wants to do, go to nonprofits, provide Trump with free travel to tout his message. It can go to almost anything else. It just can't go directly into his pocket without actually going through another avenue first.
Can it go to the Republican National Committee?
Yes, it can go to any political committee whatsoever. And, Trump is already talking about sending a lot of the money to his own super PAC, so it can be used for other political expenses as well. It could be used for legitimate purposes like presidential library, but, that doesn't seem to be in the type of behavior that Trump has shown.
Of course, it could be used to be sent to charities helping the poor and the children. There's nothing stopping that from happening, but it's not going to happen. You agree?
Well, indeed it could. I mean, legislation has been introduced by Representative Mary Gay Scanlon to require precisely that.
Craig, let's talk about the bill. You've thought a lot about the reforms of the inaugural committee, and you have some support already in Capitol Hill. As you said, Representative Mary Gay Scanlon, Democrat, Pennsylvania, has introduced a bill. It has 5 parts to it that are full of common sense. Tell us about them.
It fills in all the loopholes that we now have when it comes to regulating the financing of inaugurations. The first thing it does is it has regular disclosure, so we don't have to wait till spring to find out who gave money to the inaugural committee. Second of all, it requires disclosure of how the money's spent. Believe it or not, there's no disclosure on how the money's spent. Even though we know who the donors are, no disclosure on where that money was spent. It would also impose rules and regulations on how the surplus funds are dealt with. It would require that the surplus funds go to a legitimate nonprofit and nonprofits that are not controlled by the president-elect or a political party. So we would go to a legitimate nonprofit. These are fundamental reforms. The bill's been introduced in previous sessions, and it hasn't made it very far so far. But I got a feeling this is going to be a whole new, different scene. Trump raised $250 million. We don't know what he's going to do with the surplus. I suspect there's going to be scandal galore coming out of what the millionaires and billionaires have bought by funding the inauguration. So the mood may change, and perhaps the scandals that are going to follow will help give this bill legs.
Well, another provision in the reform bill deals with contribution limits. It places reasonable limits on the size of donations from any single source. Does it give a dollar figure?
Yes, 50,000. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, it bans corporations, especially government contractors, from making inaugural donations, and it requires inaugural donations only from individuals and no more than 50,000. 50,000 may sound kind of high, but at least it's not 5 million that we're now seeing thrown into these inaugural activities. What's interesting is that in, some previous inaugural committees, like the Bush inaugural committee, didn't want to make it look like their administration's on the auction block by taking $1 million donations from special interests and corporations. And so Bush limited contributions to 100,000, Obama limited to 50,000 as well. They just didn't want it to look like they're putting their whole administration on the auction block. Trump doesn't seem to care about that, and he's had no...
It's another one of the norms that Trump has destroyed that's spreading around the country. There's no sense of shame. And even after they're caught, there's no sense of remorse or apology.
Right.
For listeners who want to know the bill number, does the bill have a number they can go to and get a copy?
It's just been introduced about 2 days ago, so it hasn't been assigned a number yet. I'm trying to get it introduced in the Senate as well, a companion bill in the Senate as well. So hopefully we'll have that going on in both chambers.
Well, if you find out more details about this bacchanalia of money and politics called the Trump inauguration event, we'll have you back so you can tell our listeners Chapter 2. Thank you very much, Craig Holman.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
I want to thank our guests again, Bruce Fine, Robert Weisman, and Craig Holman. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And if you want to know what I'm recommending going forward, it's all in my new book, Let's Start the Revolution and Make Government Work for Its People.
Step up, you ought to step